Welcome to week 2 of module 3 of our university certificate in police leadership. And in this session, I have grouped together a number of chapters in your textbook because they kind of flow together, and that is ethical leadership or moral and courageous leadership and servant leadership. And so we'll look at those in brief together. I wanted to just give you some definitions. As you think about servant leadership and moral or ethical leadership, one of the things that police leaders do well or should do well is create a culture, an ethical culture within the organization. And that's the cultural leader, a leader who actively uses signals and symbols to influence corporate culture. Corporate culture, the culture of the organization, is determined by the leader. And if we're going to have an ethical culture, the leader will use symbols and signals to symbolize and to communicate that this is going to be a culture that is an ethical culture. And then tied to that is this notion of servant leadership. And servant leadership was developed by Robert J. Greenleaf's story of the travelers who the servant was helping along the way. And at the end of that journey, as the servant then left them, and they had to continue the journey on their own, they realized that the servant had actually become the leader. And when we think about ethical leadership and creating a culture of moral leadership, we realize that servant leadership ties into this really well. And so let's define it. Servant leadership is leadership in which the leader transcends self-interest. And that's really true ethical leadership. You transcend self-interest to serve the needs of others, help others grow, and provide opportunity for others to gain materially and emotionally. And I want to highlight for you that Greenleaf's idea of servant leadership was not only that the followers would benefit, but Greenleaf was very strongly tied to the idea that a servant leader would also benefit society, and most especially the disadvantaged in society. That is a really core tenet of Greenleaf's servant leadership. And so you can see the sort of moral, ethical focus of servant leadership as it ties to laying aside self-interest and really focusing on the needs of others and helping others to grow, both in the organization and then outside of the organization. Another definition I want to highlight for you is moral leadership. Moral leadership is the ability to distinguish right from wrong and then to do right, seeking the just, honest, and good in the practice of leadership. The just, the honest, and the good in the practice of leadership. And of course, our world today is replete with many leaders who focus on self-interest, who are not ethical and don't practice the good and the right. When we think about the ethical climate then in policing, we know that you, as you emerge into leadership, will face pressures that challenge your ability to do the right thing. There are many stakeholders that will be calling upon you to meet their particular perspective and to align yourself with their particular focus. And as a police leader, you're going to have to face that challenge and be sure that you have reflected on what are your values and how are you going to communicate those values through the organization and how those values align with what the organizational expectation is and what is defined as doing the right thing. And so there are these obstacles for leaders, personal weaknesses and self-interest, as we mentioned. And so we have to really develop servant leadership within our leadership perspective. We know that today there is tremendous pressure to cut costs and increase profits. Well, in policing, of course, the pressure is there to cut costs. And then to meet the demands, I would say, of stakeholders within the organization is also another tremendous challenge for police leaders. And so we know that leaders set the ethical tone in the organization. Number one, idealized influence, again, from transformational leadership. They act as positive role models. I will never ask you to do what I myself would not do. And we do not imbibe that very famous saying. We don't support that saying that says, do what I say and not what I do. No, do what I do. Follow my example. Great ethical leaders act as positive role models. They signal what matters by their behavior, how they treat others, how they respond to infractions, how they deal with ethical missteps, and really signals what they believe is important. Ethical leaders focus on the employees, the customers, and the greater good. That's really, really important. There's self-interest is very little at play when you have good leadership. They're not paying attention to gaining benefits themselves, and they are honest. And I think this is so powerful, especially as we think about French and Raven's 5 dimensions of power. And of course, that 6th dimension that they added, which is information, that we know we communicate well, and we'll look at that in the next module, but good leaders communicate well, and they're honest with their employees, partners, customers, vendors, and shareholders. Police leaders are honest with the officers and the civilian members, and they communicate honestly with them. And out of this, then, we know that they strive for fairness, and they honor agreements. Your word as a leader is your bond, and so you honor the agreements you enter into. And then this is such a pivotal piece of good leadership. Leaders do not seek credit, they give credit. And so they share credit for successes and accept the blame when things go wrong. They take responsibility when things go wrong, but when things go right, they give the credit where that credit is due. And here's a big one. They speak up against acts that they believe are wrong. They're willing to enter into conflictual situations because they have a high regard for self and a high regard for others and a high regard for the corporate culture of the policing organization. How we speak up, though, is also pivotally important, that we listen, that we make sure we understand before we speak to any situation, that we get the facts so that we're speaking equitably and ethically to situations. Of course, this is a great chart, and it pretty much summarizes everything we've said. I won't go through it all. The ethical leader possesses humility. The unethical leader is arrogant and self-serving, and you can work through that chart. You want to act like a moral leader. The most important factor in ethical decision-making in organizations is where the leaders show a commitment to ethics in their talk and especially their behavior. And I would encourage you to do some reading on virtue ethics and to look at Aristotelian and Confucian ethics, the West and the East, in terms of what are the core tenets: prudence, truthfulness, and try to develop those in your life more and more and really intentionally become an ethical leader. And then, of course, you want to set the culture and the norms within your organization as an ethical leader. And we know that both in people's lives and in organizations, we have the visible, such as the artifacts, dress, office layout, the symbols in the office, what people see, slogans and ceremonies, very important, your vision statement as a police organization. But then there's also the invisible, and that's below the waterline on this iceberg. Very, very important. The express values, the underlying assumptions and deep beliefs, such as people here care about one another like family. And so what are the underlying assumptions and beliefs within your policing organization, within your organizational culture? So culture is important because it integrates members so they know how to relate to one another. It helps the organization adapt to the external environment. And there is a collective identity. And again, that's why it's so important to have an ethical climate, a moral climate as a collective identity, which helps members work together. It guides your day-to-day working relationships. Will our relationships be honest? Will they be open? Will we communicate honestly? Do we stab each other in the back? Are we speaking behind people's backs? Or are we acting ethically with one another? And so that's really, really important as you set that cultural climate within your organization. Culture determines what behavior is acceptable, and it also determines how power and status are allocated. Is there fairness? And is there procedural fairness? Is there interactional justice perceived by those that you're leading? And we could talk more about those. What this shows us, and what you'll see in your textbook, is that culture trumps strategy every time. And that's why you want to build a strong, ethical, well-grounded organizational culture as a police leader. You're going to have a great strategy, but if the culture is not there to support it, it's going to be futile. So you want a high-performance culture, a culture that is based on a solid mission, embodies shared responsive values that guide decisions, and encourages individual ownership of both bottom-line results and the cultural values. So we'll end off with, how do you as a police leader strengthen and develop the organizational culture within your policing organization? And of course we know the first is rites and ceremonies. What rites and ceremonies will you build that enhance the culture, that speak to moral courage and leadership? What stories are told that remind the organization of who they are and of the great things that have been done by courageous and moral leaders before them? What symbols are important to you as an organization, and how do those symbols reflect the organizational culture and shape that organizational culture? And then what specialized language? What is your vision statement? Where is it expressed? What are your values? Where are those expressed? And how do you communicate? And finally, selection and socialization. Do you select people who are in alignment with the organizational culture, who will support that culture and are socialized into that culture, understand that culture, and then what daily actions will you enact that further enhance that culture as a police leader? Thank you so much.